So let me give you a quick tour of the solar system. This is a picture taken on the way to Mars, looking back from 5 million miles at the Earth and the Moon, where the sun's coming from the right. When you get to Mars, here are some pictures taken with the European Mars Express. This is a gorge several kilometers deep. This is evidence for some changes, sort of landslides on the surface. Things are changing from month to month. And of course, in August, the Curiosity rover landed, and for the next 10 years, it'll be trundling around on the surface of Mars. It landed in the top left, and it's going to be going through this vast crater, ending up climbing the geological strata of the mountain in the middle. Well, I hope that during the coming decades, by 2050, the entire solar system will have been explored and mapped by flotillas of tiny robotic craft. But will people follow them? This is Harrison Schmitt, one of the last people on the moon, 40 years ago. And I think the practical case for sending people back into space gets ever weaker with each advance in robotics and miniaturization. Indeed, as a scientist or practical man, I see little purpose in sending people back into space at all. But as a human being, I'm an enthusiast for manned spaceflight, and I hope some people now living will walk on Mars. They may be Chinese. China has the resources, the dirigist government, and maybe the willingness to undertake an Apollo-style program that leapfrogs what the Americans did. But if others boldly go to the moon and beyond, I think it's more likely to be via cut-price ventures, spearheaded by individuals prepared to accept high risks, perhaps even one-way tickets. When I'm a bit older, I'd accept a one-way ticket. And they'd be driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. And that's why I'm hugely enthusiastic about Elon Musk's SpaceX company and other companies fronted by entrepreneurs with resources and high-tech expertise. By the way, I think the phrase space tourism should be avoided. It lulls people into thinking that such ventures are routine and low risk. And if that's the perception, the inevitable accidents will then be as traumatic as those of the space shuttle were. Instead, these cut-price ventures must be sold as dangerous sports or intrepid exploration. And they'll just be for the few. Don't ever expect mass emigration. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. Space doesn't offer an escape from Earth's problems. But having said that, a century or two from now, there may be small groups of pioneers living independently of the Earth, on Mars or on asteroids. And whatever ethical constraints we impose here on the ground, we should surely wish such pioneers good luck in genetically modifying their progeny to adapt to alien environments. And that'll be a step towards a divergence into a new species. The post-human era would then begin, perhaps only in a few hundred years. But now, let's widen our gaze from our solar system to the world of the other stars, far beyond the reach of any probe we can now conceive. Prospects are here far brighter. We've now learnt something that makes the night sky far more interesting than it was to our forebears. We've learnt that the stars aren't just twinkling points of light. Many, perhaps most of them, are orbited by retinues of planets, just like the Sun is. This is a really fast-moving field of science. And these planetary systems display a surprising variety. Sometimes you find planets as big as Jupiter orbiting very close to their parent star, so their year will be a few days. Some are on very eccentric orbits. Several planets are orbiting binary stars, so they'd have two stars in their sky. And just in a newspaper today, I read about a discovery of a planet that would have 4 suns in its sky. So a remarkable variety already being found, a very exciting subject. Well, will there be life on any of these extrasolar planets? We can't assess the odds. Indeed, how life began on Earth is still unfinished business for scientists. We don't know. It could have been inevitable, or it could have been a rare fluke, like shuffling a deck of cards and ending up with them in perfect order. I hope we'll understand by 2050 how life began on Earth. And that, of course, will give us some handle on how likely it is to have arisen elsewhere, and also clues as to where to look. Even if simple life were common, and it may be, it's of course a separate question whether on these other worlds it's likely to have evolved into anything we might recognize as intelligent or complex. And it might be too parochial to focus on Earth-like planets and creatures like us. Science fiction writers, of course, have many other ideas. Balloon-like creatures floating in the atmosphere of Jupiter-like planets, swarms of intelligent insects, nanoscale robots, and all kinds of things. And incidentally, I would advise students it's better to read first-rate science fiction than second-rate science. It's much more fun and no more likely to be wrong, and it stimulates your imagination. Well, I'm not holding my breath for the detection of extraterrestrial intelligence, but I'm glad some people are looking. If we detect a signal as plainly artificial, then even if it's very boring, a list of prime numbers or the digits of pi, then it will carry the momentous message that concepts of logic and physics, if not consciousness, aren't limited to the hardware in human skulls, as it were. I don't think we know yet. But I wanted to mention that, of course, there are some people who think they do know the answer. They're the people who think they've been visited by the aliens and they've seen UFOs. And I get letters from such people. It's one of the results of being Astronomer Royal. And I tell these people two things. First, I ask them, is it really likely that if these aliens had made the huge technological effort to cross interstellar space, that they would just meet a few well-known cranks, despoil a few cornfields for corn circles, and go away again? I think it's unlikely. And the second thing I tell them is to write to each other and not to me. Well, we might find ET, but perhaps ET doesn't exist. Earth's intricate biosphere may be unique, and that may disappoint the searchers, but it would have its upside, because it would entitle us to be less cosmically modest, because our tiny planet could then be the most important place in the galaxy. Perhaps even a seed from which life in the far future could spread through the galaxy. The philosopher Wittgenstein famously said, if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand him. So even if we found aliens, would the culture gap with them be unbridgeable? I don't think it would necessarily. They may come from planet Zog and have 7 tentacles, but science would be a common cosmic culture. They'd be made of atoms just like us. They'd gaze out, if they had eyes, at the same cosmos. They'd trace their origins back to the same Big Bang. But of course, if we get a signal, we've got plenty of time to think of a good response, because signals take many decades to get there and back, so there's no scope for snappy repartee, as it were. It's called the Crab Nebula. It's the expanding debris from an explosion of a star, supernova, witnessed by Chinese astronomers in the year 1054 AD. Some people here can perhaps read this, but I've been told this is the record of the Emperor's court astronomer saying that a guest star had appeared in the heavens, brighter than the moon, and disappeared after a few weeks. And when we look to that place in the sky, we see 1,000 years later this. Now, you might think these supernovae are far away and long ago and irrelevant, but were it not for these, we wouldn't be here. That's because stars, during their lifetime, derive their energy via nuclear fusion. They turn hydrogen to helium, into carbon, into oxygen, etc. And then they fling it back into space. And then from that debris, new stars form. So all the atoms in our body were forged in ancient stars that lived and died before our solar system formed. Indeed, almost certainly each of us has atoms in us from hundreds of different stars from all over the galaxy. So we are literally the ashes of long-dead stars, or if you're less romantic, we are the nuclear waste from the fuel that made stars shine. We've learnt that we live in a solar system that's just one planetary system among billions, in one galaxy among billions. But perhaps further Copernican demotion confronts us. The entire panorama that astronomers observe could be just a tiny segment in the aftermath of our Big Bang, which is in itself just one Big Bang among a perhaps infinite archipelago. And incidentally, what we think of as universal laws may, in this even grander perspective, be just parochial bylaws in our cosmic patch, a patch that happens to extend more than 10 billion light years around us. Well, it's exhilarating that these concepts are not just metaphysics, they're speculative science, but they're within the scope of scientific inquiry. And I think within 50 years, we will perhaps be able to say firmly whether we are part of a multiverse. But we're still groping for the truth, where in the fashion of ancient cartographers, we must still say, "Here be dragons." We confront Donald Rumsfeld's famous unknown unknowns. And what a pity, incidentally, that he didn't stick with philosophy. How far will we have got by 2050? 50 years ago, we didn't know if there was a Big Bang. Now, as I said, we can draw quite precise inferences back to a nanosecond. So in 50 years, debates that now seem flaky speculation may have been firmed up. But, and here I'm perhaps sticking my neck out a bit, I think we should recognize that at some stage we might, as it were, hit the buffers because our brains just don't have enough conceptual grasp. After all, our brains evolved to cope with life on the African savanna where our remote ancestors lived, and they haven't changed much since then. And it's surprising, therefore, that we've got so far in understanding the counterintuitive microworld of atoms and the vastness of the cosmos. But just as a monkey can't grasp quantum mechanics, there could be aspects of reality, unified theory or consciousness or something, whose elucidation must await some post-human intellect. Maybe these intellects are out there already. If not, they might emerge in the far future. Now, let me focus back on the Earth, as I will for the rest of my talk. I've lived my life among astronomers, and I can assure you that their awareness of vast expanses of space and time doesn't make them any more serene in their everyday life. They fret as much as anyone else about tomorrow and next week. But there is one special perspective that astronomers can offer, and that's an awareness of a vast future. The stupendous timelines of the evolutionary past, as in this time chart, are now part of common culture, except maybe in Kansas or parts of the Muslim world. But most people still somehow think that humans are the culmination of the evolutionary tree. We are the end of it all. And that hardly seems credible to an astronomer. I'll tell you why. As this time lapse illustrates, our sun formed 4.5 billion years ago. It's a bit less than halfway through its life. It'll be 6 billion years before it flares up, engulfing the inner planets. And the expanding universe will continue, perhaps forever, destined to become ever colder, ever emptier. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. Even in this concertinaed time span, stretching billions of years into the past and billions into the future, this century is a defining moment. We've had these images for 40 years. They're iconic for environmentalists. But suppose that the hypothetical aliens I mentioned earlier, who are watching our planet, had been doing so for its entire history. What would they have seen? Over nearly all that immense time, 4.5 billion years, Earth's appearance would have altered very slowly. Continents drifted, the ice cover waxed and waned, successive species emerged, evolved, and became extinct. But in just a tiny sliver of the Earth's history, the last 1/1,000,000th part, a few thousand years, the patterns of vegetation started to alter faster. This signaled agriculture, the presence of humans on the scene. And then there were even more abrupt changes. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere began to rise enormously fast, and something else completely unprecedented happened. Rockets launched from the planet's surface escaped the biosphere completely. Some went into orbit around the Earth, some journeyed to the moon and planets. Well, if they understood astrophysics, these aliens could have predicted that the biosphere would face doom in a few billion years, when the sun heated up and then flared up and died. But could they have predicted this sudden fever halfway through the Earth's life? These human-induced alterations occupying overall less than 1/1,000,000th of the Earth's elapsed lifetime and seemingly occurring with runaway speed. If they continued to keep watch, what might these aliens witness in the next 100 years? And the answer, of course, depends on us. The stakes are high between progress and catastrophe. Some years ago, I wrote a short book on this theme, which I entitled Our Final Century, with a question mark, and the publisher took away the question mark, as you can see. And then the American publishers changed the title to this. Americans like instant gratification, and perhaps the reverse. And my theme was that taking all risks into account, we wouldn't wipe ourselves out, but there was a 50% chance that we wouldn't get through to the end of a century without some disastrous setback. Over most of history, the threats to humanity have come mainly from nature. Disease, earthquakes, floods, and so forth. But this century is special. It's the first when one species, ours, has Earth's future in its hands and could jeopardize life's immense potential. We've entered a geological era called the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene began, I suppose, with the advent of thermonuclear weapons. But devastation could arise insidiously rather than suddenly, through unsustainable pressure on energy supplies, food, water, and natural resources. Indeed, these pressures are the prime threats without enemies that confront us. Humanity's footprint is getting larger because we're becoming more demanding of resources, but also because there are more of us. This is how populations have grown over the centuries, very fast indeed, rising from 3 billion in 1960s to 7 billion today, and probably going up to between 8.5 and 10 billion by 2050. And most of the growth is going to be in the developing world, and the world's intellectual and physical capital is going to shift to Asia. It'll be the end of 400 years of European and North American hegemony. But the biggest gap today is between what science allows us to do and what really happens in the political and economic world we inhabit. We don't need new inventions to improve the world, we just need proper applications of those we already have. And scientists shouldn't be bashful in proclaiming a hopeful message. We can truly be techno-optimists. The innovations that will drive economic growth, information technology, biotech, and nanotech, can boost the developing as well as the developed world. And modern engineering and agriculture can feed us all. That's all good news. But of course, the intractable politics and sociology engenders pessimism. All too often, The parochial and the immediate trump the global in the long term. Politicians look to their own voters and the next election. Stockholders expect a payoff in the short run. Medical research focuses on diseases of the rich, not enough on tropical diseases. There's a current slogan in England called, "We are all in this together." It's received with a certain cynicism by many of us. It comes from David Cameron. But we need to realize that we are all on this crowded world together. Problems caused by shortage of food, water, resources, and the transition to a low-carbon economy can't be solved by each nation separately. So the question is, can our sympathies become more broadly international? Can our institutions prioritize projects which are long-term by political standards, even though a mere instant in the history of our planet? Well, I want to close with a bit of preaching, a personal perspective which strikes me whenever I visit the vast and ancient cathedral of Ely, which is just about 10 miles from where I live in Cambridge. This is 900 years old. Most of its builders had never travelled more than 50 miles. The fens were their world. Even the most educated knew of essentially nothing beyond Europe. They thought the world was a few thousand years old and that it might not last another 1,000. But despite these constricted horizons in both time and space, despite the deprivation and harshness of their lives, despite their primitive technology and meager resources, they built cathedrals, though they knew they might not live to see them finished. And their legacy still elevates our spirits nearly a millennium later. What a contrast this is to so much of our discourse today. Unlike our forebears, we know a great deal about our world, and indeed about what lies beyond. Many phenomena still make us fearful, but the advance of science spares us from irrational dread. We know that we are stewards of a pale blue dot in the vast cosmos, a planet with a future measured in billions of years, whose fate depends on humanity's collective actions. But all too often, our focus is short-term and parochial. We downplay what's happening even now in impoverished, far-off countries, and we give too little thought to leaving a fair inheritance for our grandchildren. So we do need to broaden our sympathies in both space and time, to perceive ourselves as part of a long heritage and stewards for an immense future, and to be guided by the best science, but also by values that science itself can't provide. The future is up to us. And just to finish with, I want to quote from the great biologist Peter Medawar. He said this, I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They are attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they do not make a tuneful and harmonious sound." Thank you.